Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. This is episode 35 of the Feeling Good podcast, and we are on the last segment of the live session with our patient, Mark, and the masterful facilitation by David and Jill. And so, David, can you briefly describe what this last segment is going to be about?
Well, the last segment is going to be going back to testing. It's team, CBT, testing, empathy, agenda setting, methods. We've been through all of that. And at the end,
and then testing again.
We come back to the end of session testing. And this is something that very few therapists do. And I believe that all therapists should do the before and end of session testing at every session with every patient, because you have an idea how you did in the session.
Yeah.
But my research and clinical experience has shown that the perceptions of therapists can be way off base and usually are. And so we want to find out.
It's because you didn't test me, you know. I'm doing much better than most therapists.
Yeah, exactly. To find out, you know, we measured his depression before the session, his anxiety, his anger, his positive feelings, his relationship satisfaction, and we want to find out, how is he feeling now? What, if anything, did we accomplish? Was it an effective or ineffective session? Because I've had sessions that I just thought were blowaway. They were so fantastic.
Yeah.
And then found out at the end the patient had become, you know, suicidally depressed or much worse than at the beginning. And so you need to have this data to find out. And some therapists are afraid, well, patients won't be honest when they fill out these scales. But the fact is that they're extremely honest. And the big problem we have is sometimes therapists can't take the heat. They don't like what they see. We'll also ask Mark to rate us on therapeutic empathy. You know, how warm and compassionate were we as he experienced it? How helpful was the session? How satisfied was he? Is he committed to doing homework? How helpful was the session? And was he honest in the way he filled out these scales?
And just so our listeners know, the testing, you have a sheet with two sides. The front side is the mood survey, you know, how is the patient feeling before and after the session. But then on the back, it's an evaluation of the therapy session. So the patient can say, this worked for me, this didn't work, I'm planning to do my homework, and things like this.
And I'll post this with the show notes so you can actually look at it visually. It's very impressive to look at. And I'll also put the end of session daily mood log in terms of where he filled out my role as a father and all this tremendous number of negative feelings he had.
And so, Jill, as a wrap up in the session, you went back to the daily mood log and see how Mark did on the emotions, and then you also finished with the brief mood survey and do some testing. Can you talk about this a little bit?
Sure. On the daily mood log, we have 3 columns next to the emotions. One is the percent now. That's how the patient's feeling when they're really suffering, when they're filling out the daily mood log. We have that goal column that we use during paradoxical agenda setting, which is kind of, and how depressed or anxious would you want to feel in an ideal world. And then we have the after column. And so, as David mentions in the podcast, by the end, the positive thoughts have to be 100% believable, and they have to put the lie to the negative thoughts. But also for this to be successful, I mean, if we've been targeting the positive thoughts that are actually driving the negative emotions, then we should surmise the negative emotions would go down too, right? That's sort of the point of cognitive therapy, that through a change in negative thoughts that we now are going to feel better. And so we always want to make sure we don't just assume, oh, my patient's feeling better. We actually use the daily mood log and we go through each feeling methodically and say, now, Mark, how sad are you feeling now? And how anxious are you feeling? And how guilty are you feeling? As a way to, again, collect data and make sure that we're targeting the kinds of thoughts that are actually going to cause emotional change. And then the other method that we use for testing is the brief mood survey. And so we had Mark fill out in the beginning an indication of his feelings of depression and anxiety and relationship satisfaction. And then we had Mark complete all of those symptoms at the end of the session as well, again, as a way of knowing if we're producing the results that we hope that we are.
Yeah, and there's also another part of testing on the back of the mood survey. Can you talk about this?
Absolutely. So when I meet with patients, these are all measures that have been developed by David Burns. So he has this thing called the brief mood survey, and on the backside we fill out the evaluation of therapy session form. Yeah. So for example, I have these in my waiting room, and when my patients come in to see me, they complete the before session part of the form, and then after they leave, they complete the after session ratings like Mark did, and then they flip the page over and they complete the evaluation of therapy session form, which asks the patients questions about empathy. Did they feel that I was warm? Was I understanding? Did they feel understood? Helpfulness of the session, usefulness of the session, things like that. They also get to indicate at the bottom what did they not like about the session, and what did they like the least about the session? What did they like the most about the session? And when I tell patients about this in my very first session with them, I say this is really like a quality assurance measure. This is a way that I will know after each session how I've done or how we've done together. And I hope to be extremely humble in accepting your feedback and really interested in how you experience the session. And this is because although I'd love to think of myself as sensitive and able to read my patients, the truth is that there are times where I think I've had a fabulous session, and in fact, the patient has some negative feedback, or the opposite. There are times where I'm being hard on myself and thinking we didn't cover enough, or I don't know if I was on point, and the patient says it was the best session we ever had. So these testing forms are kind of the only way that I can get accurate information about how my sessions are with patients.
Yeah, and I also see this as a little bit as a checkpoint in this session. What I notice is that it gave Mark a chance to look back and see, wow, I really went over a hurdle, and I got to the other side, and he was kind of choked up as he was noticing that.
Yeah, you're right. It's obviously not just for the therapist, for the patient to be able to see the tremendous progress that they make from the beginning to the end of a session. And then if you're seeing a patient over time, of course, and you're tracking these, then you and the patient can both look at hopefully the tremendous progress that you're making, or if you're not making the kind of progress that you're hoping, you're able to kind of check in and talk about that and figure out why that is.
Well, thank you so much. I think that this is going to be a tremendous resource for our listeners.
Thanks, Fabrice.
All right, so let's see how the last segment of the session goes.
So let's see how you're feeling right now. Let's look at the sad and unhappy. That was 60. What is that right now?
I think that's basically gone down to almost nothing.
Okay.
I'm not anxious.
Okay, that's another 0.
For feeling guilty is way down. I'm not even sure. Probably a 5 is the maximum I can put there. Feeling inadequate, I probably feel even that I have a whole lot more inadequacies, but I'm not anxious or sad about those. Mm-hmm. So I'm not a problem to just accept that.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's say even a higher score.
Okay.
And I don't think I feel lonely anymore at all. For feeling foolish and self-conscious, I don't think that's even fair. I don't. That's really not an issue. I shouldn't even. I mean, that feeling really is not a realistic feeling.
60 anyway. To 0 there.
Yeah. The discouraged and pessimistic. I'm not that discouraged anymore. Maximum, I feel like 10.
And from 80 to 10.
Yes, and that's something that with time probably will go down as I practice it. Defeated, actually, that also is almost not...
Went from 80 to 10.
Yeah, not
and
much
angry,
room for it. I think that's a 0.
From 30 to 0. Yeah. So you pretty much met or exceeded all of your goals except for the defectiveness, which you decided it's okay to be defective.
Yes.
So that went from 50 to 20, but everything else went like to 0 or 5 or 10 or some very low level. And what would you say were the healing dimensions here is question number 1. And question number 2, some listeners will be listening and say, well, wow, here's somebody who's had decades of struggle and unable to turn it around, and who's now turned it around, it looks more or less completely in just a single therapy session. And so they'll be asking, what was this, real or fake?
Yeah.
So what were the healing dimensions, and was it real or fake?
Yeah. I was, as we were talking, before even you asked me this question, I was thinking that the listeners probably at no time heard me jump or shout or cry or laugh very loud. But I was thinking that this session today, that I'm so grateful for this to have happened, this, I'm going to go home and feel like... This has been a life-changing session for me. Sorry.
That's really a beautiful thing for you to say. I'm so grateful and so admiring. And then once again, if this was a life-changing session for you, I know you've struggled so much in your life against so much opposition and oppression and trauma and horrors. What was the healing thing or the healing pieces here?
The realization that my distorted thoughts were really distorted, and taking responsibility for the whole world and concentrating it on me is not only unfair, it's just downright wrong.
Yeah.
And this is something that I tell everybody else, and I haven't been able to implement it, practice it on myself.
That's why I think the personal healing is so important, not only for all human beings, but particularly when we're working with therapists. I think if you haven't had this experience, then although you're not a therapist, I know you reach out therapeutically to lots of people because it's a love. You told me once that you wish you had gone into psychiatry instead of the specialty that you were pushed into, which you've done well with, but that unless you've experienced the death of your own ego and done your own personal work and felt those tears and felt that healing. Well, to put it positively, once you've done that, you have a far more power and healing to offer others, because you can say, I've been there myself, and I know how awful it is and how real it seems when you're beating up on yourself, and I can show you the way out of the woods as well. And then my question, I know you're interested in spiritual aspects, and would you say that this has been a psychological experience for you or a spiritual experience?
I was thinking about it as we were talking. This was a spiritual experience, tremendous spiritual experience.
What about it is spiritual?
I think mainly, to me, it was to come down from the high horse of thinking that I can change the whole world, and it's my fault that there's no good relationship, and if I had a better brain, I could have had a better relationship with my son. All of those distorted, amazingly distorted thoughts.
And you were just crying, and does the concept of sadness is celebration? It
seems like it.
Do you see what I mean? And also,
the tears came when you said this has been life changing. Yes. So they're sweet tears, happy tears, tears of relief.
Yes.
Is that right?
I don't know where the tears came from, but I know that. I hope that indeed as I was feeling, this has been a life-changing couple of hours for me.
Oh yeah, wow! And then finally the two things with the son that we could go into, that the sources of power to bring more healing there, should he be open, and we can't control him, but would be to encourage him to express his anger and to share your own tears with him. Yes. What you just shared with us, that those tears, that is the healing fluid, so to speak, or the tonic, or is it?
Yes, absolutely. Right. We feel close and intimate with other people when we can share our feelings with them, not just our positive feelings, but our negative feelings, right?
Yeah.
Our feelings of hurt and disappointment and
to
anger.
Me, those tears, that is what spirituality is. For whatever idea I have, it's fairly primitive, but when you were crying, that is the spiritual dimension.
Yes.
Does that make any sense?
That makes total sense. Yes. Yeah, that's the heart opening up.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was also thinking we need to make sure that we go back to our testing, because we always do that at the end of the session as well. And so we had Mark fill out a brief mood survey in the very beginning of the session indicating symptoms of depression, anxiety, relationship satisfaction. So we'll have him do the same exact measure again now.
It was a great session today. What helped
me? It's always an
to,
honor.
Yeah, while Mark is filling this out, was just following the steps.
Absolutely.
And if we hadn't had that structure to go through, one could have become pressurizing, panicky, confused, rambling in this direction and that direction. And I felt that it was like a ship that just carried us.
Right. We knew where we were going, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, this sounds fake because everything else is looking so good.
You know? Let's see how we're doing over here.
Yeah, this is pretty much the same. Yeah, it's improved definitely. I definitely feel close to people. I feel like I can be close to people.
Yeah, for a guy with
a hole in his
brain
brain.
defect, you're doing pretty good, you know.
We fix brains too, apparently.
Yeah, I feel far more calm and feel very much connected and very hopeful and encouraged and optimistic, and I'm very happy with life.
So that's cool. So this positive feelings went from a 34, which is kind of mediocre, up to a 39, which is fantastic, out of 40. Should we do this one too?
Oh yeah, that's right. Okay.
In fact, we could do this off microphone.
Sure.
And then we can report back later at the end of
or
session.
Or you want to, it's only going to take another,
okay,
I'm sure Fabrice will edit it out. Right.
This is just in one session.
So then we'll just read it back.
Huge
do you think?
Yeah.
Change.
Just in case you want that.
Conflict.
Yeah, we're doing fine here.
Well, I don't know if this is a specific. Oh, this is regarding my specific. Yeah, because he's not even here, so I don't know how I can rate this for after
could rate
session.
That later after you interacted with them. So we'll just skip that one, and then on the back, should we have them do this after the session or right now?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Or whatever you think.
The empathy. Let's wrap it up, and then we can report. Put it on the show notes or something. Empathy. You know, I can see here the empathy. It looks like it's going to be perfect score, and probably the helpfulness will be perfect score, and so forth. So, do you have any final comments, Fabrice?
No comments here, huh?
I just want to say, Mark, then, that I appreciate how open and vulnerable you were with us today, and that it was really joyful for me to see you move from a place of such, guilt and self-criticism and personal responsibility, intense, highly distorted personal responsibility, to just feeling a lot more at peace and accepting of the situation, and as you said, less distorted thoughts, less self-criticism.
Yeah.
feelings of happiness and joy even.
And I just feel so warmly toward all of you. Fabrice, although you were patiently, quietly doing your engineering thing, but you suggested this and made this happen. And Mark, I just think the world of you. It was a wonderful personal experience for me to be with you. And of course, I always love working with you, Jill. It's like magic to me. And
I feel the same way. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so that was a great finale. Let's have a few reflections on how this entire session went. And I'm assuming by now our listeners have listened to all the episodes that cover the session. I think we had like 6 episodes out of this one session. What would you say, how does this model, this way of doing therapy, differ from some other approaches?
Well, we'll dive right into that. Let's look at the end of session testing first, because some was on the recording and some we filled out immediately after the recording.
Yeah, so let's delineate that for our listeners.
But this was an instance where our perceptions of the session and the patient's perceptions, Mark's perceptions, were pretty similar. On his daily mood log, where he had all of these negative emotions, like he was sad and unhappy on a score of 60 on a 0 to 100 at the beginning of the session, and his goal was to lower it to 10.
Yeah.
And then he actually overshot, and it went all the way to 0 by the end of the session.
Did you try to make him sadder?
Right. Often the patients will overshoot their goals. The goal column is just kind of a temporary thing to say, how would you like to feel? But once the patient gets on a roll, they typically end up feeling quite a bit better. And so those scores were all just blow away, almost, pretty much met or exceeded all of his goals. And all these feelings went to extremely low levels, like his loneliness went to 0, his anxiety went, to 0, his guilt and shame went from 80 to 5. It was really pretty tremendous. And then
didn't quite make it on the inadequacy.
I'm sorry.
His inadequacy goal was a 5, and looks like he didn't quite make that one.
Yeah, that he wanted to go from 50 to 5, and it went from 5 to 20. And we may have to go the next piece, and how are you actually going to relate to your son before we move that one down all the way to 0. And then after the session, he filled out the brief mood survey, which was like a formal test, highly accurate test of depression, suicidal urges, anxiety, anger, and his depression score went all the way to 0 on this test as well. And if you look at controlled outcome studies for depression with antidepressants or psychotherapy, and look at where people are at after 12 to 16 weeks of treatment, you'll generally see their scores on the depression still elevated. What happened here was much more dramatic in a single session than has ever been reported in a psychotherapy outcome study lasting weeks or months.
What I find interesting is, and I don't know if this is typical, but if you look at the mood survey, meaning before you really delved into the material, the mood survey is not really that bad. A score of 2 on the depression scale and 3 on the anxiety scale. It's not extremely high. But when you go to the daily mood log, you see that his sadness and unhappiness is quite a bit higher than was seemingly apparent on the mood survey. How did you
that's
explain
such a
that?
neat thing there, because there are some people who you say would be clinically depressed who are walking around with scores on my depression test, which goes from 0 to 20, scores of 15, 18, 19, all day, every day. In other words, always feeling worthless and like life isn't worth living.
Yeah.
But then you have like the walking wounded, which is like most of the human race, where maybe things are going pretty well. I mean, Mark has got a beautiful family, a fantastic career, wonderful friends and colleagues. And so, for the most part, he's only feeling just a little bit of, sadness and unhappiness until he focuses in on this one thorn in the flesh, so to speak, and then the emotions become quite intensely negative. But his end of session on the formal test, the anxiety went to 0, the anger went to 0, and his positive feelings, listener may recall or may not, was 34 out of 40, which was pretty good. 40 is the happiest a human being can be. And 34 means that you're feeling, a lot of happiness in some categories and extreme in others. But 34, it's like needing a tune-up, not like an engine change.
Exactly, yeah.
And then at the end, it went up to 39 out of 40, which is just a tremendous level. And then he's not going to redo his satisfaction level with his son until he's talked to him. But already, it was only 2 out of 30 at the beginning, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, went all the way to 26 out of 30, even without talking to his son yet. So he's optimistic on that. And then he rated Jill and me on therapeutic empathy, gave us a perfect score, 20 out of 20.
Yeah.
A perfect score on helpfulness, 20 out of 20. And again, some listeners will say, oh, well, patients will say whatever to make you feel good. But actually, if there are therapists listening who have never used these scales, your patients will not give you perfect scores. Initially, therapists most report they get failing scores on these things from every patient at every session. It's very hard to get super high scores, but he gave us a perfect score on empathy, 20 out of 20, perfect score on helpfulness, 20 out of 20. Highest possible score on the satisfaction with the session, and highest score on commitment to homework. He indicated there were no negative feelings he had during the session that we had failed to deal with, and he indicated he was completely honest in the way he filled out the questionnaires. And what did you like the least about the session? He put nothing. And then what did you like the best about the session? He put the whole session.
So pretty strong statement about the way he felt.
Yeah, and for me, and I think for Jill and for him, and hopefully for you too, Fabrice, I think that getting this kind of result in a single therapy session, or even if it takes a number of therapy sessions, when you see that happening, and then when I asked him, is this real? Do you really feel that way? And some people will be skeptical, and then the magic happened, and the tears came, and he said this was a life-changing experience. And I think that the real wealth that we have as clinicians is probably not to make a ton of money in this career with managed care and insurance and all of these problems. If you're looking to make money, I think you need to go into computer programming or MBA in business or something like that. Mm-hmm. But the wealth that we have is the wealth of spending a morning with someone like Mark and with colleagues Fabrice and Jill, and participate in a miracle of this type. When I was in clinical practice, I saw this kind of result from time to time. It was generally after a number of sessions, but I always yearned to see this complete elimination of symptoms and that tremendous level of joy in my patients. Now with the team CBT, and I can't say it's going to happen with all patients, with all therapists all the time, but in my own experience, it happens practically every time. The first time I sit down with somebody, I always sit down for 2 hours, in Mark's case, 2.5 hours, because it's my goal to complete a course of psychotherapy in one session, or in many fewer sessions than with traditional forms of therapy. And I think because of the paradoxical agenda setting, that's the piece of the team therapy. All the pieces are important. The warm empathy we had was important. The testing was important. The methods were very powerful. But I think the paradoxical agenda setting, where we melted his resistance away, brought it to conscious awareness and melted away, that's why I and other therapists are now able to see this incredibly high-speed change in so many patients that 10 years ago I would have said this is impossible. Anyone who makes a claim that they can help someone in a single session is a quack or a fraud. I wouldn't have believed it.
Yeah, and I could imagine that maybe some of our listeners are still maybe on the fence about this. I mean, obviously we gave a demonstration here, but people may say, well, no, this is not a typical patient. This is somebody who already knows the model and is already well predisposed toward you and toward Jill. So what would you say to that?
Well, those are all good things, and we want to maintain our skepticism. We have some outcome studies right now that's just been put through the Stanford Institutional Review Board, the Human Subjects Committee, to hopefully they'll give approval to the study to find out what happens in a real world setting with real patients. But when I'm treating people, about half of the time they're familiar with my work and half the time they're not. Like when I ask for volunteers in workshops, my trauma workshop, people have had horrific traumas, often starting with sexual abuse in childhood and horrific experiences throughout their lives, and generally 10, 20, 30 years of failed therapy. And then I sit down with them. It's the same as with Mark, and many of these people have never heard of me before, not at all familiar with these techniques.
Yeah.
So I don't think it has to do with that. Although if someone knows my work and likes me, that could add to the placebo effect, or in some way, they could be more trusting and more open. But
do you sometimes do a general public workshop so that the people who come to study with you are not clinicians?
Not often. I've occasionally done general public things, like when a hospital will, like in Sacramento, sponsored a one-day workshop for mental health professionals. Then they also asked me to do a half-day workshop for the general public in a high school gymnasium. Actually, they had about 300 people there, and we did a workshop on feeling good together, the whole interpersonal model. But no, I would say that for me there's no difference really in working with a general layperson versus a therapist. Well, Mark isn't even a therapist; he's a physician.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen that, and I don't think that would bear out in a research as a variable that has to do with the speed of recovery. I would say I've always done live demonstrations and workshops, and I've always been pretty good at it, even back in the early 1980s when we didn't have any of this team CBT. It was just traditional CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. But in those days, I used to get positive results only 50% of the time in a live demo in a workshop, and 50% of the time it would just kind of fizzle out and it wouldn't go anywhere because the patient was like resistant.
Yeah.
And I didn't have all these powerful tools that I have now. Now, I've probably done 50 live demonstrations in the last 2 or 3 years. I don't think there was even one of them where I didn't get a dramatic, complete or near complete elimination of symptoms from a person.
Would you say that has to do with the tools or with the fact that you've become quite masterful at this now? So
those are all possibilities, because I think I've gotten kinder and more mellow, more relaxed in my old age. But I really think it has to do with the paradoxical agenda setting and the melting away of the resistance, because today the true therapy has gotten so easy it almost seems sinful, because when I do a live demo now, I know with almost 100% certainty the person will completely recover in one sitting with me for the first time. And so I'm very relaxed. And I know that's going to happen because I'm going to get them on my side by melting away their resistance.
Yeah.
And once they're working with me rather than against me, then it just becomes blow away. It's just so easy for them to crush their negative thoughts. I wish I'd known this like 35 years ago, but I'm glad I figured it out, during my career. Another point that I wanted to say here is that our idea of resistance is much different with Mark and with everyone who's depressed and anxious. Anyway, when I was a resident, I was taught to view therapeutic resistance, and the patient's resistance to change, fighting with the therapist, clinging to the symptoms, as manifestation of something negative about the patient. And the symptoms, like the depression, the anxiety, the panic attacks, the shame, the guilt, this was also thought to be something negative about the patient.
Yeah.
So we called the symptoms brain disorders, like social anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder.
Yeah, that's the medical model.
Yeah, is that there's something wrong with you, and I'm the doctor, the expert, and I'm going to correct this with pills or this or that brand of psychotherapy. Now, there are a few true brain disorders, like schizophrenia, which is a sad and horrible thing due to some kind of tissue abnormality in the brain, probably having to do with synaptic connections during adolescence, the inability to trim them properly. But most of what's in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, as the APA calls it, American Psychiatric Association, they're not real disorders. They're just made up things of symptoms that people have.
Yeah.
And so what we're doing here is we're saying your symptoms and your resistance to change is actually a reflection of something beautiful about you, something wonderful, not something awful. See, I was taught that you're depressed because you want to feel sorry for yourself. That's why patients cling to their depression, or they're anxious and they cling to anxiety because they're afraid of change, or they're trying to get attention from people with their depression and complaining.
Yeah.
And there's some truth in all of those formulations, but they all have in common that it's a put down to the patient. It puts the patient in a one down position, that there's something wrong with them, something negative about them. And what we're doing here is turning the whole idea of resistance upside down and saying your resistance, your anxiety shows something beautiful about you. Like I treated a woman who had horrific sexual abuse for decades. And she finally managed to get out of her marriage, and she's kind of safely alone now, but she's very anxious all the time, and she thought, well, I want to get rid of my anxiety. But her anxiety is actually a form of self-love because it keeps her vigilant to protect herself and getting into new relationships with men. It keeps her alert. It's a completely different way of looking at symptoms.
We evolved our emotions in order to make ourselves safe.
Yeah. Or because they reflect something beautiful about us, like self-criticism is the key to depression. I'm not good enough, and I'm a loser, and I failed. Well, I saw an interview with Michael Phelps. Is that his name? That swimmer who won 28 gold medals.
Yes.
And he just retired. And he said he was disappointed in himself because he only won 28 gold medals in the Olympics, which is more than any other human being by a huge margin. And there was some world record that he wanted to break that he didn't break. I think he broke like 14 other world records or more. But he said that he's very self-critical all the time, and he's never satisfied with his performance. And that was the key to his tremendous success. And so there are real benefits to the things that we call psychiatric symptoms or psychological disorders. And bringing that out makes a person proud see, Mark was so ashamed of himself. I'm a failure as a father, and then to be able to show all the beautiful things that showed about him, that's where his resistance melted. And he's a very bright guy. And once he's on our team, then we just blow the negative thoughts.
Yeah, that makes all the difference.
Out of the water, right. So that's one thing. One other point I want to make is he will relapse. I define a relapse as 1 minute or more of feeling crappy. And
Okay.
given that definition,
That's going to happen sometime.
Yeah, every day.
We don't remain euphoric forever.
Exactly. And so we'll need to prepare him so he'll know what to do when these negative thoughts, I'm a failure, so Father, come back. That'll probably take about 30 minutes. That's pretty easy to do, as it turns out, but it is an important step. And then the other thing I wanted to say is we've done what I call the internal solution. And there's also the external solution. See, the internal solution is I'm beating up on myself. I'm a failure as a father. I'm not good enough. And something defective in my brain, using all of his energy, just to make himself miserable. And he learned how to stop doing that in a completely satisfactory way, a joyous way in the session, a very moving and inspiring way.
Yeah.
But he still has the external problem with his son. So we may want to do another session with him on how to use what we've talked about in previous podcasts, the 5 secrets of effective communication, how to communicate with his son more skillfully so they can form a better relationship.
So yes, this is not really about changing his mood, but changing the quality of the interaction.
Yes, but now that he's no longer feeling so miserable and beating up on himself, it'll be much easier for him to learn some skillful verbal techniques to open his son up very, very quickly in all likelihood. And then my final point here, you may have some too, but it's just to thank the listeners. If you're a therapist, I hope you really enjoyed seeing how this new approach to therapy works. I want to thank my co-therapist, Jill. I love to work with her because she is so brilliant and so warm and so fantastic. It just fabulous experience. And if you're not a therapist listening, but a general public person or a patient, I hope you took something from this that might be helpful for you personally too, because whether you're a so-called patient or a therapist, there's a thin line that separates us, if at all. And I don't think I know of a therapist, including myself, who hasn't gone into that darkness where you're thinking, I'm not good enough, just like Mark has been telling himself, I've been a failure as a father. And that's something that we can all identify with. And to me, to have some tools to show people how to get out of the woods when you're lost, to get out of that ladder, to climb out of that dark hole, and to get back to joy and self-esteem. To me, that's the greatest gift a human being can have.
And that's why I'm in this profession. I also want to add to what you said about Jill. Jill is certainly one of the most skillful people I've met, and she is down in the trenches day in and day out. So she sees people who come to the Feeling Good Institute and who are not, coming to a workshop and who are not clinicians. They're people, who just have some, pain that they want to deal with. And so she gets to do this on a regular basis, and I know that she's helping a lot of people. We are going to try to do another live session, and if all works well, we have another fantastic clinician, Matthew May, who's one of your earliest pupils, I think.
Yeah.
So I'm very much looking forward to this. I hope we can make it happen.
Oh, I hope so too. Matt he's a lot like Jill. He's like kind of genius level IQ, in my opinion, but also extraordinarily humble and kind and compassionate. And he's just a fantastic clinician and a very beloved colleague. And then finally, maybe we should just say, if there are people listening to the podcast who want more training in Team CBT, there's a lot of resources for you on my website, feelinggood.com, workshop announcements, my psychotherapy ebook, many things. And then also, although I'm not connected with the Feeling Good Institute, I for political reasons, keep them totally independent and autonomous. But they're fantastic, and they have all kinds of weekly online training for clinicians. They also do weekend workshops, online workshops, and a variety of resources there as well.
Yeah, I just want to point out that I don't know if it's the Feeling Good Institute or if it's you who created this, those different levels of training.
Angela created that. Again,
Okay.
I didn't want to be involved directly in those things because I think sometimes people who start a school of therapy or whatever you want to call it become too political and controlling.
I know, I agree, yeah.
And so Angela was a student in my Tuesday group. She's a clinical psychologist, Angela Crum. And on one of the Sunday hikes, she said, "Hey, I'm leaving my job at San Jose State." I think she was the head of the clinic there for the students, the psychotherapy clinic. And she said, "I'm going to the Feeling Good Institute, and I'll have a little free time while I'm building up my practice. Would you want me to create a certification program?" And I said, "Yeah, go for it." And so that's been very well received, and kind of gives people, they can go level 1, level 2, level 3. You could, if you've been listening to these podcasts, and that plus getting my psychotherapy ebook and listening to it would probably, I can't guarantee it, but I think Angela would give you level 1 certification.
Yeah, I think so, because after I took a few of your classes, I could right away qualify. And I think when you get to level 4, correct me if I'm wrong, you can start instructing other clinicians. Is that right?
Oh yeah. There's certain benefits that come from each level, and gives you certain benchmarks to aim for, things you should master at each level.
Well, I think that gives the listeners quite a bit of resources. This has turned out to be a pretty long podcast.
Yeah.
But I think that people will have appreciated seeing the model being applied with a real life person, and I think that we could see that those last episodes got quite a bit of popularity.
Oh yeah,
I think it's a little bit like the cliffhanger we left them with each time. They wanted to know what's going to happen next, so now they know.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, David, and we'll talk again at the next episode.
Thanks, Fabrice.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donzel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.